Hello Tech Time Travelers, it's that time of year again where I release a reaction style sort of video. This isn't a planned thing, it's just what seems to be happening based on the timing of when things happen. Like when that chunk of PCB now recognized as one of the prototype boards for the Apple I showed up for sale. Now, I'll apologize for the somewhat random video that will accompany my commentary here. It's the price of a hot take, I guess. Anyway, this reaction video is prompted by a video by Perifractic of Retro Recipes. He's pitching the sort of thing that I'm sure any of us who have fond memories of our Commodore 64s, 128s, or Amigas might literally die for, the opportunity to purchase Commodore, or rather what's left of it, and resurrect it, kind of. Now, I should apply a disclaimer here. I don't actually know if he's serious or not. This could be just YouTube bravado, grabbing some views and stirring up discussion about the Commodore brand's current status. He's released a single video discussing the prospect with a cliffhanger ending. There's a part 2 in the works though. But again, who knows how serious this plan is or what chance it stands of ever coming to fruition. But just for discussion purposes and to give you more insight on my own thinking around long gone Commodore, let's walk through the implications if Perifractic or someone else actually decided to do something like this. Of course, it needn't be said that the former Commodore International is dead, defunct, kaputski. What Perifractic is actually proposing here is something he mused about long ago in another video, leasing or buying Commodore's intellectual property, the trademarks, the famed Chicken Lips logo, the name, and so on. It's kind of an 8-bit nerd's dream. When Commodore died, as you may know, the assets were sold off and over the last 30 years have been resold, captured, or split off to various entities. The current owner of the main Commodore trademarks is a company in the Netherlands called Commodore Corporation BV, and I think they ended up with the assets after some bankruptcy litigation involving the previous owner. Amiga is owned separately by I think Cloanto and another company. Over the years, these different owners have periodically squabbled, and misfortune has befallen some who tried to revive the dormant brand. The initial pitch in Perifractic's video is essentially to try and license the licensing, so to speak, from the current owners, and then sub-license it out to others. Perifractic's proposed company would just act as an agent to determine who got to license the Commodore marks. But at the very end of the video, he kind of teases a response from Commodore's current owners with a proposal to actually buy the company outright? Wow. Now, it sounds pretty awesome in principle, doesn't it? Commodore is a legend in computing circles. I spent a solid 1/2 of my childhood parked in front of my Commodore 64 playing Impossible Mission, Jumpman, and also just waiting for the 1541 to sort itself out enough to load a game. If I had the chance and the money to buy the intellectual property, or IP for short, yeah, just for the bragging rights alone, I'd do it, 100%, just for some not so cheap thrills. So I get the excitement, one way or another liberating the Commodore brand from its present owners and transferring it to an owner or owners who are passionate about the brand and have all kinds of ideas for it seems great, plausible even. It might be nice to see the actual Commodore brand attached to machines like the Mega 64 or the Commodore X16 or what have you, instead of having silly monikers like the C64 Mini on these products because we can't use the branding of a company that died 30 years ago for legal reasons. There's definitely a lot of nostalgic appeal to Commodore, and Perifractic goes hard on that in his video. I vividly remember Christmas of 1981 when my parents purchased a VIC-20 after my nagging about wanting a computer. I was actually disappointed that it wasn't a PET, which was all I knew of Commodore from school. I also remember my late father dabbling in programming, creating a financial program that handled our family's finances. I remember trundling through a computer store and picking up the brand new Commodore 64 and disk drive sometime around 1982. I also recall flipping through the manuals, sitting for hours, just drawing stuff in Petsky graphics on screen, even the smell of Commodore equipment brand new in the box as it was opened. And then later, lusting after the Amiga 2000 after seeing one demoed at my favorite computer store. Commodore, you died too young. Anyway, that's the backgrounder to Perifractic's campaign. In his video, he makes a very strong emotional appeal to that kind of middle-aged Gen X nostalgia, with a pretty significant segment dedicated to a slideshow of young kids playing with Commodore computers, which seems rather calculated to ramp up one's emotions. I could have easily been in one of those pictures myself. Perifractic makes the case that it would be great to revive the brand as a proper company, applying the grand old name to new products like the Mega 65 that he feels deserve to have it. He also makes the case, rightly so, that the brand has been tarnished and diluted somewhat with its haphazard application to a variety of products, not all of them computer-related. He thinks Commodore's IP should be in the hands of enthusiasts like us and licensed at a very reasonable fee to deserving projects. That's all good as far as that goes. I actually agree in principle, but as one scratches below the surface, one wonders how this is really going to work out. I'm going to be frank, you may have noticed with my channel, if you've been watching it a while, that I seldom mention Commodore at all. I think with around 100 videos under my belt, I've mentioned Commodore products just a couple of times, and that's not by accident. It's not that I hate Commodore, don't get me wrong, but I suppose I'm just a little bored with it. Remember, I spent a lot of time on my various Commodore machines as a youth. When you get older, and especially when you lose a parent, as I did with my father a couple of years ago, you realize how precious and fleeting time is, and you start thinking about how you'd like to spend what you have left. Since I did so much Commodoring as a child, I don't feel much need these days to revisit it. My wife bought me a C64 Mini as a Christmas gift one year, and I thought it was neat, but I think I've played with it twice in total. I've discovered that while I have lots of warm feelings for my 64, I don't really have the patience or reflexes to play a lot of my old favorite games anymore. After all, as Thomas Wolfe said, you can't go home again. Then there's YouTube. When early vintage tech YouTubers like 8-Bit Guy started talking about Commodore on YouTube, it was great, because nobody had tackled the subject in a comprehensive way before. Back when I was a kid, not too many people actually had a computer at all, let alone a Commodore. Finding a community of so many who shared my experiences was really cool. 8-Bit Guy in particular did a great job of answering questions that I'd had since I was a youth. But then COVID hit and a ton of people, including myself, piled into the vintage computing niche on YouTube. Commodore became a way to assert street cred. Many of the new channels leaned heavily on SID or SID-inspired retro music. After about a year of that, I was thoroughly tired of Commodore as a topic. I feel the way some college English professors probably feel about essays on Shakespeare's Hamlet. Everything that can be said about Commodore has pretty much been said, with few new insights to be gleaned. So if I hear that SID music intro on a channel, I'm probably likely to stop and move on to watching something else. No offense against other creators, I'm just not feeling that nostalgic excitement for Commodore these days. For me, Commodore isn't really a matter of nostalgia because it never really left. So that's why my channel mostly features other stuff the masses aren't familiar with, stuff I didn't grow up with. Nostalgia is defined as wistfully looking back to the past. I can't be wistful about a Mark 8 because I wasn't even born when it was first introduced. For me, each interaction with my vintage machines, except some of my PC stuff, is pretty much new territory. I'm trying to make my personal interest in these machines and the theme of the channel more about historical inquiry than sappy nostalgia. The funny thing is, I'm the type of guy a newly invigorated Commodore Corp would be chasing. And for sure, I've been tempted by some recently released retro machines that could have carried the Commodore label. The Mega 65, for example, looks awesome, until you get to the price tag. Same with other machines like the C64X. Beautiful, but not something I really need, or something I think the masses are going to snap up in the kind of quantities needed to really make money. So what's the business case here, really? And it is a business case because Perifractic says he wants to acquire Commodore and essentially run it as a business, licensing out the intellectual property or IP to worthy projects. He speaks of this as a community project, even though it would really be his and whomever he has as partners. And that's where things get kind of weird. That Commodore IP is worth money. Back in 2004, Tulip Computers, which owned what remained of Commodore International, sold the brand and assets for over $30 million. How much that's worth today, I'm not sure, but it's certainly not nothing and probably not cheap. Or is it? In one part of Perifractic's video, he states that Commodore Corporation BV's owners had apparently been considering just letting the trademarks expire. But then he later gets a voice message from the company owners suggesting they'd like to sell the whole lot to him. So it's kind of hard to say. With the exception of some fits and starts, the brand has been mostly dormant for decades. But if I had to guess, it's probably worth a lot more than, say, $10,000. Now, I certainly don't begrudge a man for going after his dreams. Perifractic seems to think there's value left in the Commodore brand, and if it were directed the right way, it could properly be revived as a going concern. And I mean, maybe, yeah, there's thousands of guys like me, mostly middle-aged Gen Xers who have fond memories of Commodore stuff, and not all of us are suffering from Commodore burnout. Many of us are in our peak earning years and are looking to spend. Check out eBay's recent vintage computing auctions if you don't believe we're ready to do that. But then again, if one could make real money on a revitalized Commodore, why hasn't it been done already in the last 30 years since Commodore folded? So far, in terms of what could be branded Commodore products, what we mostly have are sort of limited, boutique-run projects that look awesome but hit the pocketbook pretty hard. Some are literally just PCs dressed up in bread bin packaging. Cool, but do I want to spend $800 for the privilege? I'm certainly not the only one who said no thank you. The only retro computer I've actually gone out and bought is the Commander X16, and that's really just because I like David Murray. And really, I've probably played with my Commander X16 for a couple of hours at most since I got it. It's neat, but I don't really feel the need to do much with it. I'm actually kind of just an enthusiast, not a really hardcore tech nerd. I don't like programming or stuff like that. My X16 mostly sits in a box, and that's why I'm not rushing out to buy an $800 Mega 65. In his last video on the X16, I think David said a little over 1,000 X16s have been sold to date. Combined, I don't think the various Commodore adjacent retro projects have sold more than a few times that. That's pretty good for retro computer projects, but at a business level, even the lowliest, least popular model of Acer laptop probably sells many multiples what any retro computer has. Making Commodore a commercially successful brand mostly selling retro computers would be really tough. You'd need a great software ecosystem to attract users. Sure, the retro machines have done some impressive stuff on the hardware side, but that isn't enough by itself. History is littered with companies that thought that they could win market share on impressive hardware performance alone. Mindset. The new retro computers look awesome, but they mostly rely on emulation of older past systems or the dedicated work of a few die-hard programmers on the software side. What they have achieved is amazing, but it's really just a drop in the ocean compared to what, say, people developing for Android or Windows or even the Raspberry Pi churn out daily. I guess you could augment retro computer sales by licensing the Commodore logos for t-shirts and stuff like that, but how much you'd make is debatable. And you would need to make decent money because much of Commodore's IP is in its trademarks, and you need to actively use and defend those in order to keep them. That means paying the associated legal fees to register and renew, as well as sue people who don't get authorization to use them. That's expensive. Presumably any profit would go to the company owner, aka Perifractic. So yeah, there'd be a pretty big economic incentive there to sell, and stick the Commodore brand on literally anything that can make money. Nothing nefarious or untoward about that, that's just business facts of life. But it would sort of get away from Perifractic's stated goal of undiluting the Commodore brand. And honestly, making bank on the Commodore brand 30 years after it died is probably pretty unlikely. But wait, you say, Commodore was a huge brand in the 1980s. Surely it could make money with the right ownership, couldn't it? Maybe, but I think this view is largely based on what's called consensus bias. Consensus bias refers to the belief, often mistaken, that something you believe is also believed by most others. I think Commodore has more brand awareness than a lot of other legacy computing brands, but it's all relative. Even in the 80s, I'm not sure Commodore was exactly a household name. Most households didn't even have a computer back then. I feel like Commodore really only appeals to a small and shrinking subset of geeky middle-aged Gen Xers and elderly boomers, with a sprinkling of younger generations who have seen us messing about with these online and got curious. There's also non-techie folks of a certain age who will remember seeing the brand in commercials or out in the public space, but I don't think they're hankering to buy a new Commodore computer. As an example of how consensus bias can cost you, consider the case of the former Rockahula water park out in the Mojave Desert in California. Formerly called Lake Dolores, this was America's first water park and for decades drew in visitors from as far away as LA and Vegas. But then the market changed. LA and Vegas both got their own water parks and the crowd stopped coming. The original owners sold to idealistic new owners who thought spending millions on an overhaul would bring everybody back, because after all, it had been such a legendary park before, right? Surely it would succeed. But their plan didn't work. The venture folded in less than 2 years with losses in the millions. One final attempt by yet another group opened it for one more year, but since then, it's just sat there rotting away in the desert. Why didn't it come back to life? Because the market for what it offered went away. That's essentially what happened to Commodore. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of executive incompetence too, but the fundamental problem, the thing that sent its executive team scrambling for salvation in the first place, was that people were buying less and less of what Commodore was selling. What's changed in 2025? In other words, I don't see millions of general public types rushing out to buy new Commodore devices or merch. Why would they? In his video, Perifractic mentions the possibility of providing or selling Commodore branded products to institutions like schools. But why is the Commodore brand necessary to accomplish that? A brand is only as strong as the public's desire to seek it out and buy its associated products. What would putting Commodore branding on something like augmented reality goggles do to make them more desirable to educators versus just using a new brand name? The average age of a public school teacher in America is early 40s. That means the average teacher was perhaps 10 or so when Commodore went bankrupt, and I guarantee most out there probably wouldn't have a clue what Commodore was, much less be motivated to push for Commodore products to be brought to their schools over much more familiar offerings from companies like Apple. I don't think the opportunity to teach kids an increasingly archaic language like BASIC would move the needle any either. Likewise, take an amazing product like the Mega 65 and slap an actual Commodore label on it. How many more Mega 65s would really have sold with that edition versus without? Is it lack of branding that's the barrier to selling more units? Hardly. I think the more likely barrier is the price, because it's a low-volume niche product that appeals to a very limited number of people. If Perifractic's stated idea of sub-licensing the rights to Commodore's IP to makers of retro products and memorabilia for 6.4% commission were in effect right now, I'm thinking products like the Mega 65 would just end up being 6.4% more expensive than they already are. And even if people were motivated to buy something because of Commodore branding, what exactly would they be buying? Commodore's toast. It collapsed in 1994. Jack Tramiel and Irving Gold are both dead. Factories were shuttered and demolished. Offices sold and reoccupied. It's been 3 decades since the last true Commodore employee turned out the lights at work. Anything with a Commodore label on it today has about as much to do with the OG Commodore as RCA flat panel TVs do to the original Radio Corporation of America. Perifractic in his video says that this is an opportunity to produce a real Commodore computer again, but it wouldn't be a real Commodore. It can't be. Commodore's gone. Perifractic's not proposing to open a $500 million manufacturing facility to churn out new Commodore products. Whatever is produced as Commodore now and in the future is likely to be just someone else's passion project with a licensed Commodore label slapped on top of it. And I really strongly doubt that it's going to sell in the millions. A fair number of people like me who grew up Commodore are not going to just buy anything put in front of us with a Commodore label. We know products like the Mega 65 or 64X aren't authentic Commodore products, though they do sometimes look the part. And we're kind of the main market for Commodore nostalgia. In his video, Perifractic cites a study that suggests 85% of people have awareness of the Commodore brand. Well, okay, but like I said earlier, that doesn't mean they're ready to line up and buy new Commodore branded gear. So, what's really the motive here? Well, I think Perifractic pretty much says it near the end of the video. He wants to live out his childhood dream, he says, and be Commodore's new owner or CEO. I also think he may want to find some new revenue streams, because YouTube these days kinda sucks when it comes to making money. But I'm not sure why others would want to fund it via crowdsourcing. Clearly going by comments on his video, some do, but why? If I, as the general public, quote-unquote invest money in something like this, I kind of want more than a thank you from a grateful YouTuber. To encourage support for the project, he says "we" a lot when talking about decisions around how the licensing would be deployed. But it's not really a "we" thing, because legally he'd be the owner and thus the decision maker. Honestly, I'm not sure why he'd want the trouble. Gatekeeping a brand means making almost as many enemies as you make friends. I'm sure there will be tons of people who, upon hearing of Commodore's transfer to a fellow enthusiast, will want to apply the name to their products. They'll be expecting a friendly Commodore community guy like Perifractic to wave them through. When he inevitably stops some of them, what then? Then there's the usual resentments that come out when someone does something that others have dreamed of doing. They'll gripe that Perifractic stole a piece of their personal history for grubby financial gain. Some will inevitably ignore the rights, thinking that they have a green light from a fellow Commodore lover to just make their own Commodore stuff. Perifractic's company will have to send out lawyers to go after them. I just see the whole thing descending into acrimony, as most things on the internet sadly do, and after all that effort, I think we're right back to square one, aren't we? Or maybe Perifractic will wave everything through, handing Commodore aficionados a sort of Creative Commons license to bring Commodore back to life any way they can, while he picks up a percentage to pay the bills. Or his bills. But didn't he say he wanted to stop the brand from being diluted? Okay, Tech Time Traveler, you say, you've made your point. What's your big idea then? Well, that's the thing. I don't really have one. For me, Commodore is defunct. Has been for 31 years. Probably always will be. Asking for a plan to revive Commodore is kind of like asking to make a plan to raise the Titanic. I can certainly make one, but it's probably not going to work. It's like a house that burns down. You can build another one exactly like it on the old foundations, but it's not the same house. To illustrate things a bit further using an actual house as example, our old family home in Ontario came up for sale recently. I spent most of my childhood there and absolutely loved it. It was on a small acreage and had a pool and a decrepit tennis court. The foundation leaked and the tap water had the complexion of diesel, but we loved it. I have so many happy memories of family and friends gathering there. I've lived in British Columbia now for almost 30 years, but I always go back to that house in my mind, and sometimes in real life when I'm back east visiting, driving by it. For most people, thinking of childhood is comforting. There are days as an adult where you'd give anything to go back to that sense of security and happiness, being free from the worries of adult life. I often said if our old house came up for sale one day, I'd buy it and move back to recapture that magic feeling I had growing up there. Well, we went back and drove by it a few months ago for the first time since my dad died. And let me tell you, all the air went out of the tires on that idea. The tennis court was gone, the pool was filled in with dirt. It just didn't look like the house I grew up in anymore with all the renovations. Realizing that my dad was never going to walk through the front door again hit me really hard. The house is just a thing. What made it a home was all the people who lived in and visited it. Many of them have passed away. Most have moved away. I realized for the first time that Thomas Wolfe was right. You really can't go home again. I think the same applies for me with Commodore. Many years ago, I dragged out my childhood Commodore 64, anticipating feeling like a 10-year-old again diving back into the games of my youth. And it was fun for a few minutes, but it just wasn't quite the same. My parents aren't going to yell at me to go to bed or come up to dinner or go play outside because I've been on the damn computer too long. Nostalgia is like an old scratch and sniff sticker. Scratch hard and you can catch just a whiff of cherry or pizza. But it's faint now, and then it's quickly gone. Its power gets progressively weaker with each scratch. Plus, if I really want that experience again, why buy an expensive Commodore branded retro machine when I can buy one of the original machines on the secondhand market for much less? Machines that were actually built by the real Commodore. Now, the retro computers that emulate the Commodore 64 in my opinion get pretty close, but they don't quite perfectly capture the feel and characteristics of the original machine, at least in my opinion. With 12 million made, there's more than enough Commodore 64s out there to keep every 40-something Gen Xer entertained for the rest of their lives for pretty cheap. Retro computers can give us access to less accessible machines, but again, I question how big the market really is for that. So I guess what I'm saying here is while I share Perifractic's enthusiasm and nostalgia for the iconic Commodore brand, I'm not sure I see a business case for buying it. This definitely feels more like a personal goal dressed up as a business proposal. Getting back to what I would do if I had the ability to grab Commodore's brand for myself, I suppose if I were a dictator, I think I'd take the Commodore marks and toss them in a vault. Yep, just lock them up and deny anyone use of them for commercial purposes. Non-commercial or hobbyist use, sure, but otherwise give the brand a decent, proper burial. Commodore was denied that in the messy liquidation process that followed their declaration of bankruptcy, with opportunists swooping in to grab its pieces like hungry hyenas. Those of us that remember it fondly have kept it alive in our hearts, and in my opinion, that's really where it belongs. We may think preserving Commodore is important for some reason for future generations, but that's making a lot of assumptions about what will be important to others. Personally, I don't think Commodore's contributions to history are in any danger of being forgotten anytime soon, and that memory is unlikely to be helped by a Commodore-themed retro computer, coffee cup, or phone. Of course, locking the IP up is not really how it works with trademarks. Unlike copyrights, they have to be exercised, aka used, to stay valid. If the Commodore trademarks were simply let go, others could re-register them for their own purposes. There's a case to be made that keeping the trademarks and IP in quote-unquote the right hands will ensure that it doesn't fall into the quote-unquote wrong ones, but how long can that be kept up? Who will be paying for it? Is it worth the cost to defend it? People already slap Commodore's marks on all kinds of things without asking permission. It's a cultural touchstone now, much more than a functional corporate brand. Anyway, that's where I leave this. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I don't mean to be a downer or anything, it's just that 20 years in business for myself has turned me into a steely-eyed commercial realist. I'm also starting to feel a bit queasy about hanging on too tightly to the past. Nostalgia is like dessert. It's fine to enjoy here and there, but consuming too much of it is not good for your overall health. For me, Commodore will always occupy my consciousness. I don't feel the need to pay someone else's licensing fee to keep it there. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.